Good morning. This is week 9 of the Introduction to Cultural Studies, and today we'll talk about mythology and narration. You may remember the slide about mythology from our discussion of religion last week, and here we have this slide again. Mythology as part of religion, beside ritual and ethics. So by mythology I mean things like holy places, sacred stories and texts, and different types of myths. Cosmogony, that is myth of the origin of the world, of life, of the tribe, if we are talking about tribal myths. Myths as basis of a worldview, myths as metaphors of human psychology, and here we have some examples from different cultures. The Olympian gods of ancient Greece, we'll talk about them in a little moment in greater detail. One of the holy texts, the Holy Quran of the Muslims, and an image of a Hindu god Shiva. So all cultures have mythologies. Even some worldviews and some ways of storytelling that did not create religion have used mythology as a way of demonstrating human behavior, as a basis of a worldview, as some sort of psychological models, and as some scholars say, this is the way that people tell stories, and the human propensity to tell stories that really makes us human. So this is what differentiates humans from other animals. We tell stories. We build our own identities and group identities through telling stories. So here at the English Institute, when we study literature, culture, film, theater, we are all referring to stories. So let's look at the mythological aspect of storytelling and psychological aspect of storytelling, because it can be a valid way of interpreting culture as well as individual psychology. So a few names that you may want to remember. Probably the most important scholar who ever dealt with myths and mythology was Carl Gustav Jung. He was a pupil and for a time an assistant of Sigmund Freud. They quarreled over the differences in their approaches and their beliefs, and Jung went on to develop his own career as a psychologist, as a clinical psychologist. So he actually treated patients, and also as a scholar dealing with the myths and the archetypes. The archetypes that are, in his view, common to all people. He postulated something that is very controversial until this day. He called it the collective unconscious. He believed that all mythologies, all stories that people tell, as individuals or as groups, so in religions, in folk tales, in all kinds of systems of storytelling, like alchemy, for example. Towards the end of his life, he became quite interested in alchemy, are based on some common background. The common background of the human experience, of what it is to be human, of the roles that humans play in society. So we have archetypal figures, the figures of a mother, a father, a child, a trickster. So these are the roles that humans play in relation to each other, and of course, being human, You don't have to play all the roles, but you will definitely play some of them, like everybody was a child once. There are also archetypal motives, like the flood or the apocalypse. Most religions have these motives. They may refer to some historical events, like there have been all kinds of expeditions to find the residue of a devastating flood in the Middle East in centuries and millennia ago. So it might refer to an actual event, but it's more symbolic. The flood that changes the world, that destroys the old world and the new world can be created. Or the apocalypse, the end of time, the final battle between good and evil, in which, of course, good will triumph. So these are not real events, these are mythical events, even if they were inspired by some real flood or some other natural catastrophe, like, I don't know, a volcanic eruption or something. There are also archetypal events in the death of every person, like a birth, also death, also initiation. It could be sexual initiation, it could be initiation into adulthood, initiation into some profession perhaps, or some social role. Of course, in myths, it's very often an initiation of a new king or queen. So we have the changing of social status. Marriage could be such an initiation moment. So Carl Gustav Jung was interested in such moments in human life as foundation for stories. So he developed the entire theory of archetypes, and these archetypes, according to him and the scholars who follow in his tradition, are present everywhere in culture. They are just the foundation of the human way of thinking about other humans, about history, about nature, about the purpose of life, and whatever else you can think of. So all literature, all culture, painting, cave paintings, everything, it's the expression of this mythological way of thinking, of the archetypal way of thinking. Some aspects, some concepts from Jung's theory. So he was the first scholar to talk of introversion versus extroversion. So the propensity of some people to be more outgoing and sociable, and others to be more reserved and solitary. This is still a valid psychological division, and you may ask yourself whether you are more of an introvert or an extrovert. There are some people in the middle called ambiverts, but most people really are divided into these groups. It's basically what makes you rest. Do you rest in social environment with other people, or do you need time alone to relax? If you relax better with other people, you're an extrovert. If you relax better alone, you're an introvert, even though you may like people and occasionally be quite sociable. Some more concepts from Jung's theory. He talks a lot about the concept of the persona and the shadow. The persona is the mask that people wear in front of other people. So it's a kind of projection of your personality that you let other people with whom you interact socially know. So the way that you want to present yourself to the world. The shadow, on the other hand, is the darker side, it's the other side of this mask. It's what you want to repress. It's a bit connected to Freud's concept of id. So this is what you want to repress, this is what you are ashamed of sometimes. or something that you find troublesome, dangerous, violent, sexual, so something you would not like the polite society to see, but something you need to process in your own mind to be a complete human being. Another term from Jung's theory is the concept of the anima and animus. This is the idea connected with the gender of a person. So, according to Jung, in each man there is an image of an ideal female, and in each woman there is an image of an ideal male. So it could be like an idealized image of a perfect partner, but it could be like a masculine aspect side of a woman or a feminine aspect of a man. This has been contested by modern psychology, and especially if you look at the work of cognitive psychologists, they have a lot of problems with Jung. First of all, his theories are very difficult, in fact impossible to prove or disprove. There is no scientific way to measure if these things exist, and especially the collective unconscious. Is there anything like the groundwork of all human psychology, regardless of the time and place when we find human beings? Is there the common background of being human? Well, it's been postulated, but I would say the jury is still out, and some branches of psychology, especially cognitive psychology, believe that Jung was wrong, and all the Jungian psychologists, Jungian anthropologists are actually perpetuating his errors in basing their studies on the concept of the collective unconscious, which is basically unprovable. But still, even if it's not really valid on the individual level, which I don't really know it is so present in culture that I think it's still worthwhile to discuss it. And there is such a wealth of theoretical studies based on Jungian psychology that I still think it's culturally important and valid as a field of study. Jung, as many psychologists, postulated that there are different stages of life in human existence. Like Freud, he was mostly interested in men, so he didn't really spend much time trying to understand women. But for a man, he postulated the 4 stages of life that he called the athlete, the warrior, the statesman, and the spirit. So, in short, the athlete is the young man, the young, very energetic person who wants to compete, who wants to develop, and this is the time of study. This is the time of developing one's body, one's mind. This is, of course, based on the ancient model. Not everybody has to be a competing sportsman or sportswoman to fulfill this archetype of an athlete. It's rather this sort of psychological propensity, let's say, in the early stages of life. So just as a person reaches adulthood, this is according to Jung, of course, what they are mostly interested in: development of one's own body and mind. Then this idealized human male, of course, reaches the stage of the warrior, and this could mean actually some sort of experience in the military, but more often it's the time of interacting in the society. This is the time of interacting with other men for this warrior. The time of professional competition. So it could be some sort of work environment. This is the time of building a family and protecting one's family, not necessarily through military terms and through physical violence, but again, what Jung talks about is the kind of psychological motivation in the, let's say, adulthood, the prime of life of this idealized model person. Then in later life, in middle age, Jung postulates that the best way to live one's life is to become a statesman, so a diplomat, a politician, to serve the community rather than look for individual gain and individual progress. You are a developed person, you have a fairly stable situation in life, in Jung's, of course, model. So what you should do is you should contribute to a larger community. You should become the leader of your community using your wisdom. And in the last stage of life, in the older age, you can become a spirit. So in Jung's term, it means actually dissociating oneself from the material aspects of life and taking more interest in spiritual matters. It could be religion, it could be philosophy, it could be Jungian psychology, probably. This is what he meant, and this is what he postulated. So if you remember our discussion on parenthood and developmental psychology, this goes along the same lines. Of course, it was later developed greatly by later generations of psychologists such as Piaget or Erikson or Diana Baumrind, but that's the basics. That's really combining mythology studies with psychology and coming up to this postulate of the common beginnings of both. Some names of scholars that you may find useful because they write about culture and they write about human psychology, and their work is still discussed and it is reflected in the works of culture, in literature, film, and other genres of culture. The first one is Mircea Eliade, who was a Romanian scholar, and for a long time I thought he was a woman. You know, this name with an A at the end, Mircea, it's like, you know, a woman's name, but no, it's a Romanian name, and here you have his photograph. He was a man, all right, and he was mostly interested in comparative religion. So he tried to develop a theory to prove the existence of one common system of beliefs behind all religions. This is something that you may, if those of you who know a bit more about English literature and you know George Eliot's book Middlemarch, the first husband of the main heroine tries to do that and he goes mad. So I guess Eliade tried to risk that and find the common background of all religions. Through comparison, he developed the concepts of the sacred and the profane in different cultures, the origin myths in different mythologies, in different religions, the concept of the eternal return. This is the idea that in mythology, time does not run like in the real world. So mythological events happened in the past, but through ritual, they happen all the time. This is the idea that he is mostly remembered for, which is again a little bit taken from the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, but taken into more mythology studies realm. Another very influential scholar and someone who added quite a lot to to the study of mythology, but whose work is also quite controversial to this day, is a Lithuanian scholar. She was born in Lithuania. She spent most of her time in the West, in Western Europe and America. Maria Gimbutas. And she was an archaeologist and anthropologist who was very interested in the oldest evidence of human creativity, so Neolithic and Bronze Age cultures in what she called Old Europe. Old Europe is the area of the Balkans, northern Greece, and generally Central Europe, Ukraine and Bulgaria, and I think the southernmost parts of Poland also fall into this Old Europe concept. She believed this is when the first agricultural societies developed in Europe, and she believed, following some earlier scholars, as you may recall from our discussion, like Bachofen, that these earliest European cultures, earliest European agricultural cultures, worshipped the goddess, the Great Mother. So there is the hypothesis of the goddess and the matrilinear and sometimes matriarchal societies of Old Europe, so the first agricultural societies that, according to Gimbutas at least, were later subjugated by the Asian tribes who were more hunters and shepherds. So they were more patriarchal, they worshipped male gods, and so the worship of the goddess was suppressed and replaced by the worship of what she calls the Sky Father, so the male deity representing the sky or the sun, and this is still a controversial issue, whether her finds and her interpretation of archaeological remains was true. But the very idea of Old Europe and this matriarchal society that preceded classical antiquity has inspired a lot of culture and also a lot of, let's say, social thought. The work of Gimbutas influenced greatly the modern worship gathered, like an umbrella term of New Age. So all these reconstructed beliefs and rituals of Neolithic people, like the society that created Stonehenge, for example, the Celtic beliefs, the Bronze Age beliefs. Also, her work was taken up by ecologists and feminists. So she's like the mother or the grandmother of ecofeminism, because the cult of the goddess, in her view, was very closely connected with the cycles of vegetation, with the earth. So the great goddess is the goddess of fertility, of vegetation, of she's like basically the Mother Earth. And we have another female psychologist and writer. She's called Jean Shinoda Bolen, and here we have two of her books. I read them when I was younger. I wasn't a student yet. I was I think a doctoral student, and I absolutely loved them because she combines Greek mythology with Jungian archetypes. So she presents the Olympic gods of classical Greece as mythological archetypes, basically. In her other books, she talks a lot about feminism and ecology, so if you're interested in such subjects, check her out. But her main claim to fame is these two books, Gods in Every Man and Goddesses in Every Woman, in which she treats the gods of ancient Greece as psychological models for individual people. So she postulates that most people can find in their own personalities some aspects of these gods and goddesses, perhaps all of them in some percentage, perhaps a few of them, or maybe even one, but some of these archetypes are reflected in human behavior and human personality as we live as human beings. And also, this is something she's not really interested in, but if you look at it, you can find these models of human behavior also in fiction and in culture, in books and films and other forms of culture. So I think now is a good time to recall the basics, the rudiments of Greek mythology. We could have an entire course really on that. So if you're interested, I strongly suggest that you do a bit more research. What I would like to show you now are those central gods to Greek mythology and the way they represent aspects of human psychology, aspects of human behavior that can be reflected again in personal, individual psychology, and also in the stories that we share in culture. Not necessarily stories coming from the myths, they are the inspiration, but they are endlessly reworked by culture. So we continue in a while. So if you know anything about Greek mythology, you will probably be familiar with the names of these gods, and there is the first generation with 3 gods and 3 goddesses, and then the second generation of their children. These 3 gods are Zeus, Poseidon and Hades, 3 brothers, 3 kings that together with the 3 sisters, Hestia, Demeter and Hera, overthrow the rule of their father, the Titan Kronos. So let's look at these 6 characters, and they can be seen as the archetypes of maturity. So the way to be an adult person, an adult man or an adult woman, to be a kind of alpha male and alpha female. Different ways of doing that. So at least the Greeks believed that there are different ways to be a valuable human being, and each of these characters, mythical characters, might have what probably Jung would call a persona and a shadow. So let's say positive, pro-social, mild side, and also the darker, more problematic, more dangerous side, which they sometimes reveal. This is true for all the gods. Actually, in Greek mythology, among the gods there were no villains. If there were villains, they were the enemies of the gods. They could be the Titans, they could be the Centaurs, they could be some sort of groups of humans like the Amazons in some myths, but among the gods, even the cruel ones, capricious ones, there are no villains. And this is a very powerful way to treat the archetypes and also to embrace this kind of darker and more erratic aspects of the personality of each of these mythical archetypes. So let's look at Zeus. He is, of course, the king of the gods, the Sky Father. He is one in the generation, at least the third generation of gods associated with the sky, with the sun, with the thunder, and in each of the generations the son would overthrow his father. So he is the current father, let's say, the Sky Father. He represents the order, he represents the ordering principle, the law against chaos. The Greeks believed everything started from chaos, the kind of archaic matter from which everything began, and it began by the process of ordering. So the earlier generations of the gods started this, and of course the Olympians were the current pantheon that embodied it. So he is the archetype of the good king. He is the archetype of a good, caring, wise father, of the logos, that is the logical principle, the ordering principle. But on the other side, if you know anything about the myths of Zeus, he can very easily become very much like his father Kronos, an authoritarian tyrant. He is potentially violent. He has the thunderbolt, and he is not afraid to use it against people and other beings. He is a notorious philanderer. He has lovers by the dozen. He fathers children with other gods, with mortals, with other half-godly beings. So basically, he spreads his descendants all over the mythological landscape. So he's not the most loyal of characters, especially to his wife. This really shows the central duality between the persona and the shadow. So the good king versus the potential violent, tyrannical king, embodied in this archetype of Zeus. Then we have his brother Poseidon, the god of the sea, who is creative, who invents things. He invents animals. He invents the horse, for example. He creates the horse because he wants to create the most beautiful animal more than other gods could do. He is compassionate. He takes quite a lot of interest in human affairs. He helps the humans, but at the same time he is probably the most chaotic of the three brothers. He is volatile, he is erratic, he is capricious, he gets angry very easily, and if he gets angry, this is sea storms and volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. When he strikes his trident, the earth shakes. So again, this duality, and you have it in all of these mythical archetypes. The third of the brothers, the god of the underworld, Hades. He is originally not one of the 12 Olympians. He doesn't really sit in the council with other Olympians because he has his own world. He has the most responsible job of all of them, looking after the underworld and the dead and all the enemies, the beings that were cast to the underworld as punishment, including Kronos, in fact. So he has his hands full, but originally he's one of the three brothers. So Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. He is not the villain. He is not the devil presiding over hell. This is a later reworking of this mythological archetype because Hades is first first of all, he's the most hospitable creature in the Greek pantheon because he receives everybody who come to his kingdom, and he's most dependable and faithful. He is the only Greek god of all of them who's faithful to his wife. There are some stories about possible liaisons with the nymphs, but in most archetypal stories, he is the most faithful husband of Persephone, whom he abducted, but later on he made her his queen and he remained eternally faithful to her. On the other hand, there is the shadow, of course. He's the god of the underworld. He's one of the Chthonic, that is the underworld deities connected with death. So he's reclusive, he's depressive, he doesn't want to engage himself in the matters of either humans or other gods, and he intervenes very, very rarely. So here we have the three original alpha males. As you can see, they differ. Zeus being perhaps the most orderly, Poseidon the most chaotic, and Hades somewhere in between. Well, the world that he has to govern is quite chaotic in its own right, but he tries to bring some order to it. Then we have the three sisters, the three original sisters, Hestia, Demeter, and Hera. So Hestia is the goddess of the hearth, the goddess of the home, of the cooking fires, basically, of the warming fire. She is one of the eternal virgins, the only one in the first generation. So she decides to remain unmarried. She decides to remain virginal, even though all the gods want her as a wife. She is the most compassionate and helpful and selfless character in Greek mythology. She raises other gods' children, she helps everybody, she asks for nothing in return, but of course there is a darker side to it. If you know any people who are like that, they are very often shy, they are repressed, they are submissive, they can be easily manipulated, and this is what happens to dear old Hestia, who is very often manipulated by other gods and tricked by more clever deities into doing the tasks for them. Then we have Demeter. Demeter, even her name suggests the mother goddess, and she is like Zeus, who was the sky father. She is the earth mother. She is the goddess of vegetation. She is the goddess of nature, of plants, of agriculture, of harvest. She is bountiful and generous and very, very maternal, just like the earlier generations of classical goddesses. Her mother Rhea and her grandmother Gaia, the earth herself. So she is the archetypal mother nature, the loving, caring, maternal, but at the same time quite unpredictable, obsessive, possessive. You probably remember the story about her daughter, the daughter she has with Zeus, Persephone, the one who ends up being Hades' wife. And they didn't really think of this as incest. This is just, the younger generation versus the older generation. Everyone is related by, let's say, family ties, and this is definitely not a problem for the Greeks. So the way that she is obsessing about her daughter, that she doesn't want to let her go to mature and to be the queen in her own right. This is perhaps the shadow side of Demeter, showing that nature can be dangerous, can be unpredictable, can be capricious and violent. So she's the devouring nature just as well. And the last one of the three goddesses of the first generation, Hera, Zeus's wife, the queen of the gods, the goddess of marriage, the protector of women and families. All the weddings were celebrated in the name of Hera, really. She was the goddess of marriage. She was the most beautiful, she was the most elegant, majestic, loyal, like the archetypal queen, really. And after his dalliance with Demeter, Zeus actually decided to marry her and to make her his queen. And he cheated on her all the time. What did she do? She was jealous and capricious and domineering and overpowering, but at the same time she was fiercely loyal and forgiving and dutiful, I would say. So as you can see, these characters can be seen as models of human behavior, can be seen as models for storytelling, and they recur in human culture ever since, really. You may ask yourself whether you recognize these stories from literature, film, I don't know, computer games, comics, whatever, in different names. You don't have to have the names. We'll talk about it in a little moment, but it's actually about the models of behavior rather than the names and exact circumstances of these deities. So let's now look at the remaining gods. We have the younger generation. We have actually 8 more. Because Hestia is sometimes also not part of the 12 Olympians. According to the myth, she gave up her place in the council for one of the younger gods, and we are going to meet him in a moment. He was actually the youngest. But first we have Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. She is fascinating, lively, youthful. She is the most sexy, I would say the most beautiful in this kind of sense of elegance and grace. It would be Hera, but Aphrodite is definitely the most sexy of them all. The Greeks usually show her, and later artists, of course, they show her naked. They show her arising from the sea, because actually she's older than the Olympians. She is the daughter of their grandfather. Google that. It's an interesting story. So when she comes from the sea, she is a kind of old deity being rejuvenated, and Zeus asks her to sit in the council. So she's one of the Olympians, but in fact she's the oldest of them all, and she's the most powerful of them all. And as Aphrodite, she is egoistic, unpredictable, disloyal. She cheats on her husband. She has lovers by the dozen. She has children by the dozen. So she is lively and youthful and sexy and basically fascinating, very brilliant, like a shining personality, but don't count for loyalty and selflessness. Her male equivalent, to a large degree, would be the favorite son of Zeus, Apollo, the god of art and medicine, also young and beautiful and very, very brilliant, the archetypal genius. He is a genius artist. He plays musical instrument and sings, and he wins all the contests in arts. He is the god of medicine, so he heals people. He is the healing deity, but at the same time he is absolutely volatile and narcissistic. He's supposed to be the logical one. He's supposed to be the logical one as the artist, as the god of inspiration, as the god of... He's like the young Zeus, really. He is the young god that may dethrone his father. But he is at the same time the capricious, volatile, and absolutely narcissistic character. So we have like serious flaws and serious virtues coexisting in these archetypes. It happens for all of them, really. No villain here. Apollo is the brother, the twin brother of the goddess of animals, the goddess of the hunt, Artemis. So we have the first pair of siblings. We have the god of the sun, Apollo, and the goddess of the moon, Artemis. So we have those dualities, male, female, sun, moon. Art, nature. She is free-spirited. She's the goddess of the hunt. She's another eternal virgin, like Hestia, but she's younger. She's the patron of girls and young women. She's like the archetypal activist girl. So the girl who has lots of friends. She has like the court of young maidens who don't want to get married, who want to live in the forest with her, and she is the leader of this pack. At the same time, she is sometimes painfully naive, like a young girl that she is. She is impulsive. She is again presented as a kind of opposite to Apollo, who's quite calculated. She's never calculated. She is impulsive. She just acts on a whim. Then we have Hephaestus, and he is one of the sons of Hera and Zeus. According to some myths, actually Hera had him without the help of her husband. She just gave birth to him the way Gaia would give birth to children on her own. But most myths really have Hephaestus as the son of Zeus and Hera, so the royal couple. But he was rejected by his mother, who actually threw him out of Olympus because she decided that he was too ugly. He's the god of fire and crafts. He is the archetypal artisan. He's very talented and inventive and patient, but at the same time, he's quite repressed. He's insecure, boorish, solitary. He just keeps to himself. He has his workshop, some say, in a volcano, like on Sicily. The volcano Etna is one of the supposed workshops of Hephaestus, and he just keeps to himself. He doesn't want to participate in social media, so he's like the introvert type. But he is the official husband of Aphrodite, which is interesting. We'll talk about these connections between those archetypes in a little moment, but let's finish with the presentation. So that's the first son. Of course, Apollo and Artemis are also children of Zeus, but not with Hera, with one of the other deities, not from Olympus, one of the Titans, the earlier generation. And also there is Athena, the third of the eternal virgins, the goddess of wisdom and strategy. She is one of the goddesses of war, but she is the logical part of war. She is the strategy part. She is very logical, she is composed, but at the same time she can be cold and dismissive. She is the ultimate daddy's daughter. She is the golden girl. She is, according to the myth, she is born from the head of Zeus. So she's like the embodiment of the mind of God, of the thought of God. So, of course, she is the goddess of wisdom. And the other god of war, the actual god of war, is Ares. I'm using the Greek names, of course, but probably you can come up with Roman names as well, such as Venus or Diana or Vulcan or Minerva, or in the case of Ares it would be Mars. So sometimes these Roman names are more known, but I'm actually trying to go to their origins. So here we have the god of war, but the god of the fury, the chaos of war. He is passionate, he's energetic, he's quite simple-minded, but not in a bad way. And of course, as god of war, he is aggressive and confrontational and very unpredictable. And he is the actual lover of Aphrodite. So she cheats on Hephaestus with his own brother, also the son of the royal pair, Zeus and Hera. So we have the original love triangle, perhaps, with the cheated husband and the sexy wife cheating with his own brother. Two more deities, both sons of Zeus, with other characters, not his legal wife. The first one is Hermes, Roman Mercury, the messenger of gods. So he's the intermediary. He is, as the Greeks called him, Psychopompos, the leader of souls, the guide of souls. So he is one of the intermediaries even between the world of Olympus, the world of humans, and the underworld. He's one of the very few Olympians that can actually go down to the underworld. He is the god of commerce, he is the god of shepherds, he is the god of thieves as well. So he is the ultimate trickster. He's compassionate, playful, he has a lot of sense of humor, but at the same time, he is very dishonest. Being the god of thieves really means something. And self-serving. So that's the one. And the very last one, the one who takes place of Hestia in the council, so one of the 12, is Dionysus, the god that the Romans called Bacchus. He is the god of wine, he is the god of parties, but also the god of inspiration and ecstasy. So he is like the double of Apollo, really, because he's also a kind of artist, but not a logical, calculated, meticulous artist, but the artist guided by wild ecstasy and wild inspiration. This is a later deity in terms of history of Greek mythology, and he became associated with quite wild rituals and wild mysteries. As a character, as an archetype, he is perhaps the most chaotic of the young generation and the most self-destructive. He dies and is reborn all the time in Greek mythology. If you read the myth of Dionysus, this is all about birth, death, and rebirth, and this kind of eternal cycle. If you are interested, there are a few wonderful books. These are just a few titles I would strongly recommend to you in English. There are some good Polish books as well, but some titles you may, or some authors you may like to know. Robert Graves and his multi-volume book on Greek myths. Anything by Karl Kerényi, the scholar of Hungarian origin, and especially his book on Eleusis, which was the cult, the temple of Demeter and Persephone. So the whole story about Demeter and Persephone and the myth of vegetation. And perhaps the best book on Greek mythology I have ever read, by the best scholar who ever wrote, in my opinion, of course, you can have your own, on that, Roberto Calasso, The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony. Absolutely wonderful. If you're interested in Greek mythology and you want to read just one book and you know a little bit already, go ahead and read this one. If you want a primer, if you want a good primer, there is a very good primer, very recent one, by Stephen Fry, a very talented character from Britain, and a writer, actor, activist, and this is in 3 volumes. The first one about the Greek myths, the Greek gods, is called Mythos. Then there are heroes and Troy about the Trojan War. So we continue in a moment. So continuing, what can be done with these characters? Actually everything, and everything has been done. I told you that the Jungian psychologists use them as some sort of models of individual behavior, and perhaps looking at these models, you can recognize some elements of that in yourself, in people around you. I would say this is an interesting way of analyzing people, but it's not only about characters; it's also about interactions and relations between those characters. And when I talked about the classical archetypes, I chose as illustration the classical sculptures, but now let's talk a little bit about the possible interactions between these characters. And to illustrate that, I actually found modern artwork, like the comic book art style, online, and just to first of all show you that you can imagine these characters in any way you can. There are some clues in ancient literature, in, I don't know, Homer and Hesiod and ancient Greek dramas, but you don't have to. And as you can see, artists imagine these characters in very different ways, and you can use them as models in very, very many different ways. So let's look at some interesting aspects. So the first one is here, the first generation Olympians. And as you remember, 3 brothers and 3 sisters. So we have one of the central concept, the concept of the Trinity, which is absolutely central to many mythologies, and Greek mythology is not an exception here. If you look at the way that the 3 brothers and 3 sisters are positioned together as kind of parts of a triangle, parts of a trinity, you can see that the male gods are more concerned with space, so the sky, the sea, and the underworld, and the female gods are more or less connected with the earth, but also they are more connected with the time. So like the girlhood, the prime of life, and the older age of a person, initially of course being female deities of a woman. So Hestia as the perpetual maiden, Demeter as the archetypal mother, the kind of bountiful woman in the prime of her life, and Hera as the archetypal queen, the wise woman, the powerful leader. So you have more of that in Greek mythology, or any other mythology for that matter, but this is the kind of central concept, the trinities, the triangular relationships. Then of course we have various models of couples. The central couple, Zeus and Hera, the royal couple with the very virile king spreading his seed everywhere, and the patient queen who's very dignified, but she has to bear a lot of injustice and a lot of humiliation, so it makes her very jealous and potentially violent, especially towards the women. So there is a pattern here, a cheating husband and an endlessly forgiving wife. Then we have Poseidon and Amphitrite. This is again the model when one of the brothers marries outside of the Olympus. So not one of his sisters, because one of them would be the eternal virgin, the other one the goddess of vegetation, who wouldn't have anything to do with the sea. So he marries one of the creatures from his own realm. Then we have Hades and Persephone. So, and here is a cover of a wonderful graphic novel. If you don't know it and you are interested in Greek mythology, absolutely find it online. Lore Olympus. This is the story about the Greek gods, and especially Hades and Persephone, in a slightly modernized way, very cleverly done, beautifully drawn, and I would say one of the most interesting recent reiterations on the Greek mythology. We have another couple, Ares and Aphrodite, so the goddess of love and the god of war. So a very archetypal pair of the most feminine woman and the most masculine man. The woman who is all about love and beauty and sexuality, and the man who is a kind of man's man, very aggressive, very confrontational, and bursting with testosterone. Let's put it this way. We have other couples. Some of them are permanent, some of them are just temporary, like Zeus and Demeter, who recreate the pattern of the Earth Mother and the Sky Father, and they produce Persephone in effect. We have the couple of Aphrodite and Hephaestus, so the reclusive, ugly artist or craftsman, and the beautiful, sexy woman, who may be interested in his intellect, perhaps, in his talents, rather than his looks, but she is ultimately too volatile to stay with him for good. Actually, most of Greek gods were bisexual, so we have lots of stories of male and female lovers, especially of the younger gods, like Apollo and Dionysus. They have affairs by a dozen, really, with men, women. They have children who become leaders of their communities and kings of their cities. They create plants and other things in memory of their lovers, very often male lovers. So for the Greeks, this was nothing unusual. It was just part of human behavior, and especially in younger men, this was even expected, to have some sort of experience with other men. So Greek mythology is absolutely full of that. Some versions of Greek mythology for children are actually quite Baudelarized, that is to say, censored of all the sexual elements, but sexuality is absolutely crucial for Greek mythology because it's all about generation, about starting cities, starting communities, starting tribes, usually as descendants of some god. So they had to father the progenitor of the tribe or the kingdom. So there's a lot of that. We have the stories, the archetypal stories of parents. So I told you about Zeus and Athena. So Athena bursting, complete and armed, from the head of Zeus. You may want to Google how it started, and that there was a mother after all, but she was kind of integrated, in fact literally swallowed by Zeus. But Athena is his favorite daughter, the warrior princess, daddy's girl, ultimate daddy's girl. She can do no wrong for Zeus, really. And a similar situation is with Demeter and Persephone, so the archetypal mother and daughter. Persephone is the ultimate mummy's girl. She is the treasure and flower and absolute obsession of her mother, who wants to keep her in perpetual maidenhood. Of course, it doesn't work because it rarely works in the human world, and so it doesn't really work in the God's world as well. Other stories of gods as parents, there are all those children of Zeus. Zeus and Apollo, Zeus and Artemis, Zeus and Hermes, Zeus and Dionysus. Dionysus is also born out of Zeus, because when his human mother dies in rather dramatic circumstances, Zeus takes the fetus of Dionysus and puts it in his leg, in his thigh. So he is born from his father's thigh. Apollo and Artemis, the twins, so the perfect sun, the perfect shining sun, and his sister, who is another type of daddy's girl. She has daddy issues. She tries to convince her father that she's worthy, that she's as good as Apollo, that she's as smart and as useful as Apollo. So we have quite a lot of such stories. We have the two sons of Hera, Ares and Hephaestus, who are, you might say, the highest royalty, but they are treated differently. They actually serve other archetypes, because we have other archetypes here, like Ares and Hephaestus would be the dualities, like the warring brothers, the siblings that hate each other. One is ugly and smart, the other one is pretty and dumb. That's basically Ares and Hephaestus. Hephaestus is ugly and smart, and Ares is pretty and dumb. So they hate each other. They share a wife, really, but there is a lot of bad blood between them, and they are fighting all the time. On the other hand, we have the perfect siblings. We have the divine twins, Apollo and Artemis, who are absolutely fiercely loyal to each other, despite their all flaws, despite the fact that Artemis is so chaotic and volatile and Apollo is so narcissistic. They are fiercely devoted to one another. They would defend each other against everything, and this is the archetype of the eternally supportive siblings. You have more such images in Greek mythology, but that's the first one, that's the archetypal one. We have another trinity, the trinity of loose cannons, Aphrodite, Hermes and Dionysus. They are unpredictable. They are charming and brilliant and ecstatic, but at the same time completely disloyal and completely unpredictable, but they make the world an interesting place, perhaps. If we look at another possibility of a trinity, the three bastard sons of Zeus, Apollo, Hermes and Dionysus, each representing some aspects of masculinity, especially valid for young men. So wisdom and talent and wit and charm, and basically you have such lineups everywhere in Greek mythology, because in fact they reflect the possible lineups in human society, in human relationships. We have another trinity, the virgins. So if you remember Hestia, Athena and Artemis, so the ways of being a useful young woman before you marry. This is what the Greeks believed, that of course a truly useful woman would later on marry in the appropriate time of life, which was like the later teens. But the maidens are absolutely vital. They represent wonderful things. They represent wisdom in Athena, freedom in Artemis, service to others in Hestia. So there is another trinity of the younger goddesses of the first and second generation. We have some contrasting pairs, like the two gods of war. the war between Ares and Athena. So the war, really the war of the sexes, so between the men and the woman, both of them warriors, both of them expert warriors, but also the duality between brute force and strategy. So something that the Greeks would find absolutely indispensable in terms of ruling kingdoms, in terms of warfare. There are other dualities. I told you about Athena as a double to Mars, or as part of the Trinity of Virgins, but she could be seen as a double of Poseidon. There is a myth when Athena and Poseidon vie for the city of Athens, and they present their gifts to the citizens of Athens. And Athena wins because she gives the citizens the olive tree. Poseidon gave them the spring of water, but the spring turned out to be salty. So, but the duality, in terms of mythical symbolism, the duality of Poseidon and Athena is really the duality of nature versus civilization. Nature represented by the sea, by the weather, by the world of animals, you have to remember the horse, of course, and by Poseidon, versus logic, civilization, the law, and wisdom, represented by Athena. What else do we have? We have the duality of Apollo and Dionysus, a rather interesting duality of two types of artists, so logic versus ecstasy, and actually these two gods share the temple in Delphi. For most of the year, this was the temple of of Apollo, and in the winter, Apollo went away, and Dionysus took over, and this was the temple of Dionysus in winter, and they would kind of circulate. They would interchange as gods of this temple in Delphi, the main temple. So connected with prophecy and such things. There are all kinds of other stories. We could have an entire course on that and the representations in culture of these stories, but just to give you the idea what to Google. Heracles and his labors, another bastard son of Zeus with a mortal woman and his famous labors. Jason and the Argonauts, Theseus and the Minotaur, Perseus and Pegasus, Orpheus and Eurydice. So this is the heroes, the half gods. So usually the sons of gods. Could be Zeus, could be Poseidon sometimes, and their exploit in the human world. And then the last great myth, it is the Trojan War, with the greatest hero of them all, Achilles, and some other stories connected with that, the Judgment of Paris, so the beauty contest between another trinity of goddesses, Hera, Athena and Aphrodite. The story of Helen, who betrays her husband with Prince Paris. The story of the war itself, the Trojan horse that the Greeks construct to get into the city of Troy, and then the story of Odysseus and the way that he returns from the war for another 10 years. These are the bits that are present in culture, that are present in literature, of course, starting with ancient texts, mostly of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, but you may want to ask yourself at this point how these myths have survived. You can see some logos here of products and businesses that have survived and they use associations with Greek mythology, you may ask yourself about the motives in literature, I don't know, decorations, the sculptures on city squares that still refer to Greek mythology. Why is it so persistent? Because it's true at the psychological level. So let's look at some other scholars, the psychologists and anthropologists who develop in this Jungian tradition, the archetypal tradition. The first one would be Joseph Campbell, remembered for his book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and he is basically mostly interested in the heroic myths, in the stories of the archetypal hero, and in his view they all represent one story, which he calls the monomyth. And here you have the slide with the cycle of departure, initiation and return. And this could be true about any of the mythological heroes, but also, according to Campbell, for general use in culture, literary heroes, and also at the psychological level for the personal development of human mind. So, of course, we need to remember that real life is not like the myth, because it really has a very clear purpose. The myths are there to show the purpose. But if we look at the monomyth as a template for literature and for culture, you have this departure, initiation, return, with all those little things, as you can see, the call to adventure, refusal to overcall, meeting the mentor, and then the adventure begins. Crossing the first threshold, and all the adventures in the underworld, the initiation, encountering challenges, encountering difficulties, and meeting the helpers, meeting the archetypal female, because of course Campbell, following Jung, following Freud, mostly talk about men. I would say it would be interesting to imagine the monomyth for a heroine. Unfortunately, what the Jungian psychologists say is that the heroic journey for a woman is to find the alpha male and start bearing children. That's what they suggest a woman should do. But if we look back to Greek mythology, you can see there are more ways to being a woman than following this one archetype. There are many archetypes of being a woman. So we have the initiation, we have the return, so the threshold, again crossing the threshold from the underworld, so from the darkness, from the kind of night of initiation back to the world, because this is what completes the journey, the resurrection, the return with the wisdom, return with the treasure, and being, what he says, master of both worlds. So returning with the treasure back to the world of people, to be the leader, to be the mentor perhaps for the next generation. And the last name I would like to draw your attention to is a rather controversial psychologist who is still incredibly popular nowadays, Jordan B. Peterson. And he is, I would say he is very interesting as psychologist, clinical psychologist, interested in mythology as a way of explaining the world, but he follows the same line of thinking with all the errors, I would say, of the earlier generations of Jungian scholars. He's mostly interested in men, but if you disregard that, his books can be quite interesting, with a pinch of salt, as they say. So don't swallow it whole, okay? If you want to read one of his books, I would recommend Maps of Meaning. This is the book about mythology, about the archetypes, about the way that they explain the world. But then again, he's mostly interested in men. But his way of looking at psychology from a mythological perspective, I would say it's very interesting. If you are willing to disregard some of the sexist stuff, misogynistic stuff basically, and some of the problematic politics, we'll talk about it in the coming weeks when we talk about politics, the right wing and the left wing, and what to make of it. So I would say take his mythology, but do not really follow his politics. But this is, you can also find online the entire courses by Peterson. So if you would like to see that, absolutely see the Maps of Meaning. The Maps of Meaning, I think, are really interesting course on psychology of mythology in this kind of Jungian tradition. He talks about Jung a lot. And here are two slides from Peterson's course on the Maps of Meaning, and this is the one with chaos. He represents chaos as a dragon that combines the serpent, so the snake, the predatory cat or some sort of beast like a lion with the claws, and the bird with the wings, so kind of attacking from all sides. He sees the human civilization as the way to bring order into chaos, and this is why he called his following books Beyond Order, or 12 Rules for Life, an antidote to chaos, because chaos is the unknown, and he thinks the archetype of Mother Nature represents chaos, and civilization is represented by the Sky Father, by the male god, the Logos. And one of the examples that he shows in his course is this medieval figure of the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus, which opens up like a little shrine, and there are quite a few surviving examples of these opening Mary shrines, and this one has apparently God the Father inside Mary and Christ on the cross. And the way that Peterson explains it is that this is Mother Nature, so the kind of chaos that surrounds human civilization, the Logos, represented by God the Father, and the suffering individual, that is the hero of what you might call Campbell's hero's journey, which represents the idealized human being, the individual. And for Peterson, it's a very potent symbol of Christ on the cross, because it represents voluntary suffering, the voluntary sacrifice. So very, very interesting, and it actually brings you to other mythologies than the Greek, because the same archetypes and the same stories or similar stories can be found in any other mythology. Egyptian, Hindu, Christian for that matter, and different, let's say, mythological stories. So here we have some more titles of books who talk about archetypes, who talk about this sort of storytelling for wisdom and for, let's say, philosophical development, but who do not really rely on ancient Greek mythology. I told you the examples from ancient Greece because I liked Greek mythology, but you could do it for any other mythology. If you are familiar with any other mythology, try to find such elements. So here we have Women Who Run with the Wolves by another psychologist. and Anam-Cara, the book of Celtic wisdom, and Sophie's World about philosophy. Okay? So these books show you that you don't need the Greeks. Actually, one of the books by Roberto Calasso is about Hindu mythology, and he generally shows the same stories, similar stories. Sometimes the relationships between the archetypal characters are slightly different. So of course there is a difference, because why then would those mythologies develop? Peterson is quite fascinated with Christian mythology. I think he describes himself as an agnostic, which I share, but he is quite fascinated with Christian mythology and the way it reworks the myths. You can find it actually everywhere. All cultures developed storytelling. This is something that another, I would say, influential, although quite controversial thinker now postulates, and I mean Yuval Harari. He thinks that this is what makes us human, the ability to tell stories for our own psychological representation and development, and also to create communities and to build group relations. There are other ways of looking at archetypal stories as plot points, and here we have two books. One is the book about screenwriting by Raymond G. Frensham, and the other one is by Christopher Booker, The 7 Basic Plots. And what they talk about, these are actually guidebooks or some sort of workbooks for people who want to start creative writing, and they are looking for regularities in storytelling. So this is taking archetypal plots into another level, into the level of literature proper. So what we have, and as you can see, they, especially Frensham, they use a lot of mythological allusions here and characters to illustrate his points. So what do we have? We have the hero or conqueror with a fatal flaw, like Achilles in the Trojan War. We have the Bildungsroman, so the innocent hero, the archetypal hero's journey, really, the development of a young hero. And this is actually illustrated by Voltaire's character Candide, who is the innocent, who learns about the world. Then we have the rags to riches story, illustrated, for example, by Cinderella. We have the story of Faust. So the man looking beyond, a scientist, trying to understand the world, trying to gain the knowledge. This is a very powerful myth, for example, in Norse mythology, when the central god, Odin, actually sacrifices his one eye to learn wisdom, to learn the wisdom of the runes, of the letters. So the bargain with the devil, that's one story here. We have the stories centered on femme fatale, with the character of Circe, who is one of the characters in the Odyssey. She seduces Odysseus and makes him stay on an island with her for a time. We have the story of star-crossed lovers, like Romeo and Juliet, but many other examples in literature and mythology and stories. We have the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, dealing with grief and loss and death. So very powerful. a very powerful story. And the last one in this lineup, because there are many, you can just find basic plots or archetypal plot structures, and you'll find many more propositions. The last one here is the story of Tristan and Isolde, or Oedipus, the story of a tragic conflict, fate, betrayal. It could be triangles, so kind of love triangle, like here we have the star-crossed lovers, but with a husband on one side, or the fate, the situation when characters are unable to prevent their downfall. So as you can see, hopefully now, this is a wealth of culture. This is basically a treasure chest from which culture has always taken its inspiration at all levels of culture. So art and social life and individual psychology as well. And the very last slide shows a famous quotation from a Danish philosopher, Søren Kierkegaard, from the middle of the 19th century. Life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. That's the main difference between an individual life and the life in the stories. We read the stories to understand human behavior, to understand also our own behavior as humans or people around us. The only way we can understand it is by identifying the motives, looking back. But, as the wise dog says here, it must be lived forward. So, thank you and see you next time.